All right, we'll go ahead and get started with our Sustaining Barley Webinar Series for today. Thank you very much for joining us. And this series really is meant to strive to serve as a forum for conversation and sharing of our great ideas to advance sustainability in the malting barley industry. So we hope you'll join us over the next several months as we bring forward innovative research and practices through the supply chain that's helping the malting, brewing, and distilling industries meet their sustainability goals. I want to thank my partners on this series, the Brewing and Malting Barley Research Institute and the Canadian Malting Barley Technical Center. I know we've got Gina on here from BMBRI, so thank you very much. And also a big thank you to the members of our respective associations, including the American Malting Barley Association, which makes these possible. So if you've registered for the entire series, you have or will receive a calendar invite for each of them. But thank you for showing up today. If you want to be able to attend any of the others in the future, just be sure to hop over to the AMBA website and get registered for those. And then finally, each of our presenters today will present for about 20 minutes each, hoping to leave about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Feel free to drop questions into the chat if you would like to, and/or go ahead and come off mute after the speaker is done and we can have a bit of a discussion. We really do strive for discussion in this series, so we don't want you all just to be hiding behind the Zoom wall. We want you to be able to come off mute or engage in the chat so that we can have a discussion about these really important topics. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Brady Goettl, who is an assistant professor of extension soil science at North Dakota State University. His expertise lies at the confluence of soil fertility, soil health, and farmer outreach. He's a Wisconsin native and worked several years as a crop advisor and nutrient management planner before joining NDSU back in 2020. And in his current position, he collaborates with researchers, extension personnel, and producers to conduct research and outreach to help North Dakota farmers implement soil conservation practices and improve fertility management. So he is an excellent person to speak with us today about fertility challenges within our barley production system. So with that, Brady, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you for that introduction, Ashley, and thanks for the invite from you and from everybody at AMBA. I appreciate the opportunity, and I appreciate all the past and hopefully future work with all the folks in the barley industry. So as Ashley said, this presentation is going to focus a little bit on how we dial in our nitrogen recommendations, our nitrogen application program, in order to increase the profitability, quality, and environmental stewardship. Now, this is a big topic. It's a lot to cover in 20 minutes. So I've actually put together some different resources that I'll touch on a little bit in this presentation that I encourage you to check out afterwards to get a little bit more information and a little bit more tailored, in-depth, applicable recommendations as well. So I sent those to Ashley that she can drop in the chat at some point. And there are a few QR codes throughout this presentation that I encourage you to check out as well. So over the next 20 minutes, firstly, I just want to start out why does nitrogen fertility matter, both from an agronomic and from a sustainability environmental standpoint. From there, we'll roll into what I call the realities of nitrogen. So we have an ideal world and we have the real world. How can we try to make the ideal nitrogen world fit within our realities of what is actually happening on farms? And then lastly, let's talk about approaches to developing and implementing these recommendations that are in the best interest of everybody, from yield maximization to sustainability maximization. So any conversation about soil fertility really has to go back to the basics. So any of you that have taken an intro to soils class, an introductory ag class at any point, have likely run across Liebig's law of the minimum. So that's the idea that yield of any crop is proportional to the amount of the most limiting nutrient, whatever that may be. And in general, in most of our cropping systems, especially in cereal crops, that most limiting nutrient is nitrogen. It's fleeting from our fields. It's not highly available in the environment. So really applying the right amount of nitrogen is going to be proportional to the amount of yield that we're going to get. Unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we're able to make nitrogen one of the least limited nutrients at the expense of potential over-application and environmental effects as well. So it really becomes a balancing act. Because if we lived in an ideal world where everything worked out perfectly, we would be able to apply fertilizer, especially nitrogen fertilizer, when and however it was convenient to us as a farmer, as a consultant, without any risk for losing it from the system. Ideally, all that N that we apply would become plant available. So if we put on 100 pounds of urea, 46 pounds of nitrogen would be available, could be taken up by the plant whenever it needs it. Ideally, rate wouldn't matter so much. If some is good, more is better. Let's just make sure we have enough out there for the crop. And then yield is always going to increase. Quality is always going to be great, provided that we have enough of that nutrient. And then at the end of the day, for a farmer, profits are going to increase. So this is the ideal world. This is what we should strive for as nutrient management planners. But we have to recognize that in the real world, most of that isn't necessarily true. Source, timing, and placement really does matter from both an agronomic efficiency standpoint to an environmental standpoint. Unfortunately, N is very susceptible to loss. So every pound of nitrogen we apply or that we have available in that field isn't necessarily going to become available to the plant. And we'll talk about some of those reasons here in a little bit. Yield and quality can increase with applied nitrogen or not, depending on your environment, depending on how much you're applying. And that's directly related to the profits of it. Profits can increase with fertilizer application until it starts to decrease because of the negative effects that we could get from over application. So considering how nitrogen reacts in the real world, we often talk about the 4 R's of fertility management. So within the agronomic part of the way we manage fertility, we can look at, are we using the right source? Are we using the right rate of fertilizer? Is it put on at the right place? And are we putting it on at the right time? So if we can maximize these 4 things, hopefully we can maximize fertilizer efficiency from an agronomic standpoint. Now, within a greater field of nutrient management, we also have to look at it from the environmental, economic, and social standpoint as well. Even if we're agronomically maximized, how is it affecting those 3 other realms as well? So this really becomes a big picture issue with a lot of different facets when we think about overall nitrogen management. So I talked a little bit before about, N is fleeting from the system. There's a lot of ways we can lose it. Globally, only about 33% of the nitrogen that we're putting on is actually going into the plant. We have about a 33% efficiency. And when we look at the way nitrogen occurs in our fields, generally we can boil it down to 2 main forms. That's our organic and our inorganic nitrogen. Now, don't think of organic and inorganic as food organic. Think of it as, chemistry organic. So organic nitrogen is the N that's in crop residues, that things that were once living. Organic N on the other side would be, we're getting to that elemental level, those ions, those cations. Now, these two can flow from one pool to another. As that organic residue is broken down, the inorganic N is released. As it's taken into plants, on the other hand, it turns then into organic nitrogen. Where we actually start losing a lot of this is from that organic pool. Ideally, we'd lose it to nutrient uptake in plants. If all of the inorganic N goes into the plant, we could have an 100% efficiency. Unfortunately, we lose a lot of it to ammonia volatilization, so into the atmosphere, denitrification in wet years of nitrate, then becoming a gas, going into gas form and being lost as well. And then another thing that's often talked about is leaching. So the nitrate leaching into groundwater, eventually reaching surface water, etc. There's a lot of ways that the applied fertilizer disappears from the system and isn't useful to us from an agronomic standpoint. So going back to the 4 R's of fertility management, there's 2 I want to focus on today. The first one being source. There's a lot of discussion about sustainable end sources. How can we look at different ways of manufacturing fertilizer? And I just want to provide an overview of what some of the things that people are concerned about and where we think we can really move the needle on sustainability. So broadly, where can we get our applied N? What are our different sources? The first one that comes to mind, obviously, is fertilizer nitrogen. Whether that's in the nitrate or ammonium form, in general, it's going to be inorganic nitrogen. We think of organic folks that have animals that can apply manure in order to get nitrogen. So potentially that may increase sustainability of the system, but that also introduces some complexities on how to manage that manure and the potential other effects that we would have from applying that to the field. Residues also, think of cover crops, of green manures, of leaving crop residue on the field then to decompose, which becomes a source of nutrients and nitrogen. I do a lot of nitrogen rate trials and that type of thing, and we always have our check plot where we put on zero nitrogen. So even though we apply zero nitrogen, that doesn't mean we have zero crops. So there's N coming from other places besides applied fertilizers and organic residues and that type of thing. And from the soil, we have free living N fixing bacteria. We'll talk about that a little bit for the products that are trying to harness that, but naturally those are in the soil fixing some nitrogen for our plants. Also, our organic matter breakdown is providing nitrogen as well, in addition to atmospheric deposition of nitrogen, potentially nitrates in groundwater, and then biologicals, question mark. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit. I want to segue a little bit and just talk about colors of ammonia quick. So I get a lot of phone calls about, brown ammonia and gray ammonia and pink ammonia, what that actually means. So it very briefly, it's just an indication of the carbon intensity and renewability of the ammonia manufacturing process. So whatever our fertilizer nitrogen product is, it's derived from ammonia. And typically that's produced as part of the Haber-Bosch process. So again, going back to chemistry, thinking about taking nitrogen from the atmosphere, traditionally some hydrogen source, which was natural gas or coal, going through the process, producing ammonia at the end, and then releasing CO2 and water as a result of that process. So whatever the color of ammonia is, they're all chemically the same. So when people think if it's a gray ammonia, so that would be produced using natural gas, releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, it's still going to be simply NH3. There's going to be no color difference in the actual fertilizer. So one of the resources that I will have, and then also generally cost of that product is going to increase as the carbon intensity decreases. So as that product becomes more sustainable, the cost of that product is going to go up. But at the end of the day, that product is still going to have the same fertilizing power regardless of the way it was manufactured. So that's the biggest point I want to drive home is at the end of the day, it's the same product. The colors just refer to how it was produced and how sustainable that's assigned. So one of the resources that I'll make available talks about more of these colors of urea, colors of ammonia, and has this really good table that kind of breaks down each color, what it really means, and where generally it's going to be available in our product stream. Also touch briefly on biological and alternative amendments. So a few slides ago, I said biologicals question mark. That's an entire presentation for itself. So I encourage you to check out a couple of resources that talk about some of these products. The first one is a research compendium. This is put together by one of the national committees. So all land grants contribute to this. If you follow that QR code or that link, that'll be available. You can actually type in whatever product you're interested in, and that'll bring you all of the land grant and university research surrounding that product, talking about how it works in the situation that it would work in. And then lastly, here's an NDSU publication talking about different asymbiotic and fixing products. So those would be the liquids or dries that we'd apply to the field in an attempt to increase those free living and fixing bacteria. So there was a multi-state research project, which I encourage you to check out as well, that covers a few of those products. But this is a big picture thing, and there's not enough time in this presentation to cover all of it, so I encourage you to check these out. Also, when we think about our end sources, we can think about different products that we can apply to that nitrogen fertilizer, whatever color it may be, in order to increase its efficacy. Broadly, those can be nitrification inhibitors. So before, when we looked at the end cycle, nitrification was one of those where we moved from an ammonia or ammonium into nitrate, which could then be lost through leaching. So we can apply a nitrification inhibitor to prevent that process from happening. And then that ammonium would still be plant available, but wouldn't necessarily be lost to leaching. So this is one way to keep it a little bit more contained in our field, available for plant uptake. So a product of this, for example, would be like a DCD and nitropyrin. Also, we have urease inhibitors. So these are used on urea-based fertilizers, again, in an attempt mostly to prevent any type of volatilization loss. So a significant amount of research has been done on these products, and there's also a resource available that we'll send out later that talks about some of these, how they work, and in what situations they're best used to increase the sustainability of those products. Moving back to our 4Rs, the second thing I want to talk about is fertility rate. So this is something that land-grant universities, us folks in Extension, have worked on for a long time. What are the most effective fertilizer rates, not only for nitrogen, but all fertilizers? And the reason this is such an important fertility management question really comes back to, are we going to be deficient, sufficient, or toxic? And there's kind of a small window where as we apply more nutrients, so on here it says tissue nutrient concentration, this would be the same as if it was soil nutrient concentration for most cases, where if we have low concentration, plant performance is going to be pretty poor. We're deficient. We're not reaching our full potential. As we apply more of that nutrient, or as the plant takes more of it up, we're going to hit that sufficiency range where productivity can be maximized, our use efficiency is going to be the highest. And then as we start to apply more, so this is where if some is good, more is better starts to break down, that we can actually apply too much and plant performance is going to fall. So when we think about why we develop nutrient recommendations, it's really so we can try to hit the sufficiency category and maximize sufficiency and efficiency. Specifically with nitrogen and barley systems, we have some outcomes on either side of the under or over fertilization that can hurt our yield and hurt our quality as well. So if our field is deficient, those crops are deficient, we're obviously going to have depressed yields. From a quality standpoint, that's going to lead to thin kernels and then just overall plant health. So if we think of human health, for example, if we don't have the nutrients we need, that opens up the window to all kinds of diseases and disorders. And the same thing is true for plants. If they're struggling from a fertilization standpoint, that's going to open up the door to other issues. On the other end of the spectrum, if we over-fertilize, that can lead to excessive grain protein content. Lodging, for example, where yes, yield is high, but it's so high that the plants start to fall over. And then also by just having extra nitrogen in the system, that's going to lead to leaching losses and then generally just an overall higher cost. Where we want to be again is right in the middle. So we have the optimal rate. We're going to have an ideal grain quality from a plump and thin kernel and a protein standpoint. And then also what we're doing here at NDSU and a lot of other land-grant universities, this is the rate that maximizes farmer profit. Notice it doesn't talk about maximizing yield, rather maximizing profit. So in order to create these recommendations, we have a few different approaches. So the yield goal, relative standard yield system, and then the economic optimum rate. The first one, and the most traditional one, is the yield goal approach. Now, this was used by most land-grant universities. This is the way recommendations were originally developed. And it's under the attempt to relate yield directly to N availability. So, for example, if you are going to grow 40 bushels of whatever crop, it takes, a pound of N to produce 2 bushels. That was the way this was calculated. And then later on, those equations also started to consider additional N sources or N credits. So if you planted a legume crop, for example, you could decrease the amount that you would need to apply as fertilizer. And these were simple equations. So, this N number is whatever that relationship between nitrogen and bushels per acre or tons per acre, whatever that yield goal is, whatever credits come off of it, and that's how much you'd have to apply as fertilizer. So if we take some of the data that we've collected here in North Dakota with two-row malting barley over the last few years, this is what the yield goal relationship would look like. So total known available nitrogen, that would be our whatever crop credits we have, however much fertilizer we applied, whatever our residual nitrate in the field was. And you can see it doesn't really represent that curve very well. This would have a very low R squared. It's kind of a spattering all over the board. So why don't we still use the yield goal approach in North Dakota? Well, obviously it's that weak relationship that we talked about before. There isn't a strong trend. Also, we have the difficulty of predicting yield at the time of fertilization. When we go into the spring, we don't know what our weather conditions are going to be. We don't know what our end goal yield is going to be. So we have to just guess that we're going to have X number of bushels per acre. It also ignored field to field variability of N efficiency and nitrogen cycling. And that's kind of why we have that spattering, that inconsistency of the trend. But why was it used? I mean, it's easy. It's simple to calculate that. And also, it's logical to expect that our inputs are going to relate directly to our outputs. So N should have a relationship with yield. Unfortunately, and this is one of my favorite quotes from a nitrogen cycling paper, is logic is sometimes referred to as the systematic method of coming to the wrong conclusion with confidence. So even though it's logical to think that N and yield are directly related, maybe that's not the best approach because there are so many other factors impacting that N cycling. So how can we improve our recommendations? One approach is the relative or standard yield approach. So we look at standardizing the yield within each environment. The actual amount of yield doesn't necessarily matter in this situation, but we're just looking at 100% yield, whatever bushels per acre that may be. And then all other yields are just proportional to whatever that maximum is. We also have to take, in this situation, all forms of N into consideration, not just fertilizing nitrogen. And when we combine the data at each site, it's all equally represented regardless of what actual yield is. So in practice, what does this actually look like? So this is the same data set that I showed earlier on from our North Dakota N rate studies. And if we take all the sites, whatever the maximum yield was in that particular field, set that equal to 1, all other will fall in line below it. Now we actually have a nice regression, a fairly strong representation of that response of yield to nitrogen. So to develop a recommendation out of this, we just find where the top of that yield curve is. At this situation, we recommend 186 pounds per acre will get you to that maximum yield in all fields, regardless of what that actual yield number is. When we think specifically about barley, protein content is something we have to consider because as we apply more nitrogen, our protein content is going to go up. So a nice thing about that relative yield is regardless of what our bushels per acre are going to be, our data shows that at that 186 point, we're going to produce a barley of about 12.8 protein content. So we're below that 13% cutoff that most people hold. So what about the variability? Well, how can we only recommend one rate of nitrogen? So in a low yield environment, so fields that are too wet or dry or sandy or clayey is going to have a lower end use efficiency. So we're going to have to apply more nitrogen to create that same amount of yield. And that could be from less N mineralization or potential denitrification. In a high yield environment, so all of the good things we think about in the field, ideal moisture, favorable soil texture, that's going to have a higher nitrogen use efficiency. And at the end of the day, then we're going to be able to produce more yield with the same amount of N. So regardless of the actual environmental implications, the rate to produce whatever that 100% yield is going to be relatively the same as we showed in that relative scale a couple slides ago. So to create a recommendation from this, we then take it a step further to that economic optimum rate. So using that relative curve, we can put it through some calculations where we figure out how are we going to make the most profit from that curve. So these are the tables that are published in our recommendation guidelines. So for example, if nitrogen costs about $1 per pound of nitrogen, regardless of what the fertilizer product is, barley's at $6 per bushel, then we say about 124 pounds of nitrogen will make you the most profit. Well, remember a couple slides ago, it was 186 pounds to reach maximum yield. How do those two numbers work together? So we can go to the tale of two nitrogen rates. So in this plot on the screen, we see fertilizer cost obviously is going to increase in a linear fashion. Regardless of how much we're applying, dollar per dollar, that fertilizer cost is going to stay the same. But if we look at gross return and net return, so gross return could represent that yield curve that we talked about earlier on, where as we apply more nitrogen, we start to get more return in yield until the point that we start to turn down because of yield loss from excessive nitrogen. And in the middle of their net return is just the difference between those two lines. So if we apply 125 pounds of nitrogen, that would be the peak of our net return curve from that graph or that table I showed earlier. If our goal is to produce maximum yield, we're going to be at the top of our gross returns, but as you can see, we're starting to fall down on our net returns. So only looking at maximum return to nitrogen, it's about $200 per acre in returns that we could make from that lower nitrogen rate as compared to 173 from that higher nitrogen rate. Now, these numbers you have to remember only look, first of all, these numbers, that's figuring in we had to apply all of that nitrogen as fertilizer, it all costs us money. But if we think of all the other inputs of nitrogen, so our recommended rate is that 125. If we subtract off legume credits, if we subtract off residual nitrate, now we're down to about 40 pounds of applied fertilizer per acre. So that's going to significantly increase those return numbers. So what are the take-home points from the last 20 minutes? First of all, there's no silver bullet for increasing fertilizer efficiency. Those 4 Rs, we have to take each part of that into consideration. And between the right rate, timing, placement, and source, we can move the needle towards improvement of sustainability, but there's not one thing we could do that's just going to overall improve the system. We have to take each piece of it into consideration. Fortunately, there are many research-based tools available to help us improve that efficiency. And again, I hope you check out some of those resources that I've included as well. And then from the rate standpoint, this economic optimum end rate is going to help us reduce fertilizer application while at the same time increasing farm profitability. So overall, we could apply less fertilizer, which from a sustainability standpoint is great. We increase efficiency, and at the end of the day, our farmers and producers are going to be more profitable. A little bit of further reading, all these resources will be included, including some extension circulars we put out, peer-reviewed articles, which are open access, so available to anybody through that link that'll be available. And with that, again, I appreciate being invited today and excited for the Q&A session coming up later.
Thanks so much, Brady. We'll go ahead and switch gears and switch over to Mike to present. And while that's happening, just wanted to point everyone over to the chat because I did drop a Word document that Brady had shared with me that has some of those resources, links that you can access some of the things he talked about today. So feel free to go ahead and click on that file and save that to your computer so that you have that. So turn it over to you, Gina.
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. We're really pleased to have Mike Hall here today. Mike was born in Australia and raised in Ontario, where he graduated from the University of Guelph with a master's in weed science. Since his graduation, Mike has worked as a crop specialist with Alberta Ag for about 10 years, later moving to Saskatchewan in 2005 to work as a crop consultant in Yorkton. And finally, in 2013, to his current position where he coordinates the program at the East Central Research Foundation and Sunset College in Yorkton. So thanks for being here, Mike.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm the research coordinator for our Yorkton research farm, and it's a collaborative effort between the Suncrest College and the East Central Research Foundation. And today I'm going to talk to you about our enhanced barley variety trials. And really what we're trying to get at is, do input requirements differ between varieties? So much of the research that I'm going to talk to you about today comes from these agrarian locations scattered across Saskatchewan. My location's here in Yorkton, and we have 8 of them across the province. Much of this work was supported by SAS Barley and the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. So I guess back in 2007, sorry, I'm just moving something here. There you go. I guess back in 2017, Metcalf was a variety that was pretty popular with maltsters. But we had better varieties that were on the horizon at the time, like Synergy. And varieties like Synergy were about 15% higher yielding than Metcalf. And so I surmised that, boy, that's quite a bit of a yield bump with these newer varieties. And I wonder if their nitrogen should be managed differently between the varieties, because as you know, as you increase the yield potential of a variety, you tend to decrease its protein content through dilution. So we put together a nitrogen response curve for Metcalf and Synergy. And what you're looking at here is the response, the grain protein response to increasing rates of nitrogen. So Metcalf's in blue and Synergy is in orange. And let's assume that once you get over 12.5% protein, you're running a risk of being rejected for malt. So we don't want to go above that. So if we take that into consideration, you can see that you could be pushing the nitrogen rate for Synergy 44 pounds of nitrogen per acre higher than what you can for Metcalf. Now, I'm not suggesting you should push it 44 pounds of nitrogen higher, but that is how much extra nitrogen is required in order to achieve the same level of grain protein, which is at the 12.5% range. So now we're looking at the yield responses. And again, Metcalf is in blue and Synergy is in orange. And if we use those same 2 rates of nitrogen that achieve 12.5% protein for both varieties, you can see if we apply that much, we'll end up with a 13 bushel per acre benefit to having grown Synergy over Metcalf. But again, that's not taking economics into consideration yet. So if I use some older economics, these are all Canadian dollars. This is sort of a poor financial situation. So nitrogen for this example was $1.18 a pound, and malt barley was $6.76 per bushel. So taking those economics into consideration, we only need to put down about 12 extra pounds of nitrogen per acre for the Synergy over Metcalf. If you use a more happier financial situation for malt barley production, you might be able to get a difference up to maybe 20 pounds of nitrogen required more for Synergy versus Metcalf. So we did show that those 2 varieties could be managed differently on the basis of nitrogen. So that led to another series of trials wondering if nitrogen can differ between varieties, let's take these same 2 varieties again and try a whole bunch of different other inputs and see what we get. So in this case, we varied seeding rate, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, PGR, fungicide at either flag or early heading. Now, we didn't look at every combination of those factors because that would make the trial astronomically large, but we did look at those factors in sort of blocks. And we had 15 site years of data, and I grouped them into high and low yielding sites to analyze them differently, because the low yielding sites were suffering drought over this period, and the high yielding sites had more moisture available to them. So on average, our high yielding sites were 86 bushels per acre with a grain protein of 11.3% protein, and the low yielding sites averaged only 39 bushels per acre with a very excessive protein of 15.7%. So management A is basically doing the least amount that you need to. So we have the least amount of inputs in management A, and as we go through the letters here, you're getting increasing levels of inputs. And for the majority of the increases, you're putting more down, basically. You're making your costs higher. And you can see here, for the low yielding sites, doing the least amount is going to be the most economical situation. We've got the second highest yield, and it's not statistically lower than any of the other management scenarios. In fact, it's higher yielding than a couple of them. So doing the least amount under drought conditions was the best. And the other thing is that lower level of management has only 200 seeds per meter squared as opposed to 300 seeds per meter squared. And under drought conditions, that probably lessened the interplant competition for water and was probably a benefit. If we look at the response to PGR, we found that the application of PGR in F actually reduced yield by about 10%. And this also increased thins and delayed maturity by a day. Now, this isn't a big surprise under the low yielding drought-stricken sites, because making your crop shorter during a drought really isn't a beneficial thing, and it's not a recommended practice. But it does show a potential risk that we have seen on field scales in our region as well. If we look at the high yielding sites, they were more responsive to a number of added inputs. They increased to increasing nitrogen from 80 to 107 pounds of nitrogen per acre. We had increases in small increases, but significant increases to additional fungicide at flag, which was already on top of an application that occurred at the fusarium head blight timing. We got a bit of a numeric increase to the fusarium head blight timing. And our responses to fungicide were not huge in this study, because it was really, even for these high yielding sites, it was very dry environments that were occurring. We didn't have a lot of precipitation. The reason these sites yielded very well is that they were living off of stored soil moisture. And we had no response to seed treatment. Again, conditions were ideal at seeding, warm soils. And we had no response to PGR. There was just no lodging occurring at this time. We haven't really had good lodging occurring since 2015 at our Yorkton site until this last summer, and I'll get to that at the end of this presentation. So then we moved on to what we call as the enhanced barley variety trials. And Mitch Japp with SAS Barley put a lot of effort into designing which varieties that were going into these trials, into the enhanced barley variety trials. And so in this case, we looked at the malt barley varieties, Synergy, Connect, and Fraser versus the feed varieties, Ossison, Claymore, and Oriana. And we looked at them under various management scenarios, 4 different management scenarios. So we compared what was standard versus enhanced rates of nitrogen. And those rates of nitrogen varied somewhat between location, depending upon the historic yield potential for that location. For us in Yorkton, the comparison was between 130 and 162 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Now, this includes what is in the soil plus the applied nitrogen. We also looked at plant growth regulator, which in this case was Modus trinexapac ethyl, and that was applied at the first node detected stage. Fungicide was also applied, and it was either Trivipro or Nexicor applied at the flag leaf stage. Well, it turned out that many of the sites were relatively dry in 2023, except for Outlook, which was under irrigation, and Swift Current, which received 95% of their annual rainfall, but unfortunately some of that came in the form of hail. So they didn't have very high yields, as you can see here from this chart. This figure, you can see the fungicide in blue versus no fungicide in yellow really didn't increase yields for us at any of the locations. For the most part, fungicide did not affect grain protein either, not surprisingly. However, there was an interaction at Yorkton which found the grain protein for synergy was significantly reduced by fungicide, implying the yield may have been increased by fungicide, but this was not supported by what we observed in the yield data. Disease levels were very low in the study as well, but we did manage to find some responses to fungicide in terms of visual coverage of the penultimate leaf for disease. And this was particularly noted with the variety Oriana, which is the feed variety here in green. So you can see that when you apply fungicide on the left side, it drastically reduced the amount of leaf disease for Oriana, but really didn't affect any of the other varieties as they were already very, very low. And this trend was apparent in Yorkton and in Scott and at Swift Current. At Swift Current, you could also see there was a bit of a response to Claymore, which makes sense because both Claymore and Oriana are susceptible, rated as susceptible to netted net blotch, whereas the other varieties are more resistant. However, even when the untreated level of leaf disease was still low for Oriana and the application of fungicide, it did result in a yield. It didn't result in a yield increase. PGR also didn't affect yield at most sites, as lodging wasn't an issue. The exception was at Swift Current, where we had that hail event, and I thought, well, maybe the PGR helped the crop stand up better after the hail, but this didn't come true with looking at the lodging results. So I'm not sure what happened there, but as you can tell, at 20 bushels an acre, yields were pretty miserable at that location. PGR did reduce the height of barley, but it seemed more effective on the malt barley varieties that we had in the study than the feed barley varieties. At Indian Head, the height of the malt barley varieties Synergy, Connect, and Fraser were statistically and significantly reduced by the plant growth regulator Modus. But if you look at the feed barley varieties, they were numerically decreased in height from PGR, but none of those were statistically significant. And this pattern, like you can see here in Oriana, there's very, very slight decrease in height. And this pattern was maintained at multiple sites. Here at Yorkton, the malt barley varieties are all getting substantially reduced in height from PGR. And the feed varieties, not so much, particularly Oriana is almost identical. Same pattern again here at Melfort. Malt barley varieties getting statistically reduced, and not so much for the feed barley varieties. And you can see here, Oriana has actually got is a little taller for the PGR treated barley. So we didn't have significant lodging in these trials. So this difference in heights, we couldn't equate to differences in lodging, but I would think it would be a pretty safe guess to say that the application of PGR for varieties like Oriana would be less beneficial. One, because the variety is sort of on the shorter side. It's not getting affected by the PGR. It's not decreasing in height. And it has already a very good rating for lodging resistance compared to, say, a variety like the Synergy, which only has a fair rating for lodging resistance. And finally, enhancing the rate of nitrogen by 30 pounds did not increase yields at most sites, except Indian Head, where there was another interaction. And at that site, enhancing N rate only increased yields for Connect and Claymore. But I wouldn't read too much into this because it wasn't a consistent pattern amongst the other locations. Enhancing N did increase grain protein as expected at all locations. And as an aside, I'm going to show you some cherry-picked data here that shows a phenomenon that I frequently see, but can't always confirm because my nitrogen ranges aren't always wide enough. But I frequently see that the most economic rate of nitrogen for a new high-yielding malt barley variety is often higher than it is for feed. And this is one example here. Here you're looking at Synergy in blue, the malt barley variety, versus the feed barley, Ossison in orange. And the arrows are showing you the most economic rate of nitrogen for both of those. So the blue arrow for the malt and the orange arrow for the feed. And this often, from my experience, occurs where you get the most optimum level of nitrogen occurring before you've exceeded that 12.5% level of protein that would get you rejected for malt. So despite seeing this quite frequently, if you go to our provincial crop planning guide, they will assume that your feed barley is producing 17 more bushels per acre than the malt. And then it should be fertilized with 18 pounds more nitrogen per acre. And they're not alone. There's software that provides end recommendations based on soil tests. And I went in there and I plugged in a yield goal of 80 bushels per acre for the same soil test containing 39 pounds of soil in the top 24 inches. And the recommendation came back saying you need 85 pounds of nitrogen for malt and 101 pounds of nitrogen for feed, even though they've got the same yield goal. And so I think the reason for this is one, we're probably all these recommendations are being based off of old data when malt was a fair bit lower yielding variety than feed barley varieties. And I'd say the other factor is fear. Nobody wants to be recommending to a malt producer excessive rates of nitrogen that are going to result in a drier year in getting them rejected for malt. But, I think it's worth revisiting some of these old recommendations because I don't think they're really realistic. And now that a lot of our malt barley varieties are quite comparable in yield to our feed barley varieties. So this year's enhanced barley variety trials, obviously I don't have all the data for this, but I do have a little bit of data to share with you of what happened this year. And now we've switched up the malt barley varieties to Prairie and Churchill, and the feed barley varieties to Durango and Wrangler. Now, these varieties were chosen as sort of a best guess of what's coming down the pipeline and what might be popular. And the goal here is to try to get out ahead of when farmers are adopting varieties so that we can give them information. We've got data to give them information for the varieties they are currently growing, as opposed to playing catch up. So those are the varieties that we've got, and we evaluated them under the same 4 levels of management as we did in the previous enhanced barley variety trials. And PGR here in blue significantly reduced the height of barley at all the reporting sites that I have so far. No interactions with variety were detected. And this led to PGR significantly reducing lodging at these sites. So 0 means there's no lodging, and 9 means it's flat to the ground. But there was an interaction at Melfort. At Melfort, lodging was significantly reduced by the plant growth regulator for all the varieties except for Durango, which didn't lodge with or without the PGR. And this fits with the lodging ratings, as it's rated as having very good resistance to lodging, whereas the others are either fair or good. However, yield-wise, only increased the yield significantly at our site here in Yorkton, and that was by 11 bushels per acre. And this corresponded to decreasing the protein, which was also a benefit in malt barley, of almost 1%. PGR also reduced yield by a couple bushels at swift current under drought, but the difference wasn't statistically significant. I was actually pleased to see that we had lodging levels high enough to show a benefit of PGR, because it's been a long time. Like I said before, it's been since 2015 since I've been able to find a benefit from using the product. Yorkton and Melfort had significant yield responses to applied fungicide as well, even though the leaf disease levels were relatively low. The yield increase also resulted in a reduction of about 0.7% less protein. So excepting adding nitrogen, anything that you do to increase yield is going to decrease grain protein through dilution. We didn't have any significant responses to enhanced N, but it did increase the protein at Yorkton to dangerously close levels to causing rejection. At the three highest yielding sites, Durango, the feed variety in gray here, was the highest yielding variety. So in conclusion, and probably some questions, the most economic rate of nitrogen is higher when growing a higher yielding malt barley variety. So in the case of Synergy versus Metcalf, you could consider 10 to 20 pounds of nitrogen more per acre. However, Metcalf is no longer is a variety that's in decline with maltsters, and the remaining popular varieties have much closer yield potentials. So I don't expect to have big differences between those varieties in terms of the optimum amount of nitrogen. New malt barley varieties yield similarly to feed, and that begs the question, from my perspective anyway, should we still be recommending considerably more nitrogen to the feed varieties? PGR can increase yields when lodging is an issue. It can also decrease them further in a drought. PGR reduced the height for the malt barley varieties in our first enhanced barley variety trial, more so than the feed varieties. And I don't know why. Perhaps varieties like Oriana were already short. Maybe that has something to do with it, but I don't know. And fungicide only occasionally provided a yield benefit because we've been relatively dry in recent years. But varieties like Oriana and Claymore, which are more susceptible to leaf disease, certainly seem to visually show a benefit from the application of fungicide. So yeah, management can differ between the varieties that we have growing here in Western Canada. And I'll end it there.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mike. And thanks also to Brady for your presentation. Now I'd love to open it up for some Q&A. Really appreciate the content today. I know sometimes talking about fertility recommendations isn't the sexiest thing in the world, but we also recognize when we're talking about sustainability, it's likely one of our greatest opportunities to have significant impact in lowering things like greenhouse gas emissions or just improving yield and being able to do more with less. So really value the real foundational knowledge today around some of these issues. So thanks for that. We do have one question in the chat from Sam Anderson. For Brady, in general, are there any application types of N that have lower losses and or lower carbon footprints?
It would, yes and no. So it kind of depends overall on the method that you're applying that product. So at the end of the day, we can think about anhydrous ammonia, for example. If you're in a system where you're applying that in the fall, anhydrous is going to be more efficient than applying urea in the fall, for example, just because of the different loss pathways. At the end of the day, it'd be hard to say one product is going to be more efficient than the other, just because there are so many different opportunities for it to be lost. In a specific environment under specific conditions, yes, one could be preferable to the other, but not for all environments under all conditions.
Oh, it depends. We say that a lot.
It depends. It's my favorite catchphrase in extension.
Yeah, for sure. Gina, you got your hand up?
Yeah, I was just curious, Mike, with the increase in yield of the new varieties, are you able to make any comments on nitrogen use efficiency with these newer varieties?
Well, I guess that's the implication there. You know, they are providing more yield per a given number of pounds of nitrogen. So it is improved nitrogen use efficiency, and you see that with all, you can look down, like in wheat even, you just look down, the higher yielding wheat varieties tend to have low protein associated with them. So these varieties are putting out more bushels per a given level of N. So yeah, it's improved N use efficiency.
All right, Hiroshi?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry, my camera is not on. Okay, thank you very much, Brady and Mike. It's very interesting presentation. And my question is regarding to identify high yielding and low yielding site. So like we tend to use like high yielding and low yielding, and most of the time I kind of refer to the depending on the environment, but there are many criteria to decide high yielding and low yielding sites. So like soil characteristics and basically historical data. And nowadays we are seeing some potential to use a remote sensing and so on. So, like, I think this question may be both, but what your definition of high yielding and low yielding site? Yeah.
Well, I guess for me, it was, I had to draw a line somewhere, and I had a cluster of sites that were sort of in that 70 to 100 bushel per acre range. And then I had a cluster that were 20 to 60 bushels, this sort of thing, or 20 to 50 bushels and that sort of thing. So there were, it's just the way that season turned out that we had some sites that had considerably more moisture, a better moisture situation than others. And of course, going right across Saskatchewan, historically, we have, that swift current area. As soon as you get into the southwest of Saskatchewan, it is normally much drier in that area than in, say, our black soil zones. Our brown soil zones are much drier areas than our black soil zones, which are more to the north and east in the province. So yeah, I just arbitrarily, made a call, basically. Yeah.
Mitchell, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks both Mike and Brady for your presentations. It was good to hear. My question's for Brady, and your graph where you showed the different rates of gross returns, net returns, and the price of fertilizer, the cost of fertilizer increasing as the rates increase. Then you went to the next slide, though. You accounted for the soil contributions, mineralization, and available N in the soil. If you go back and apply those to the chart, your line for fertilizer increase of cost is going to start at, well, in your example, it would start at 80 pounds, which would shift your net return to the right, where your peak of your net return is to the right. So have you looked into that, how that would impact where that economic optimum rate of applied N is, how much different that is depending on what your prediction is for mineralization and currently available soil N?
Yeah, so you're right. As you know, that we have to have kind of that benchmark somewhere. So when we assign that fertilizer N value, we have to assign that same cost to what we'd have for residual nitrate, we'd have for our credits as well. So obviously, if we're gaining more from residual nitrate, then our overall cost would decrease because there'd be less fertilizer to make up that component. The difficulty with trying to assign that value is every field is going to have a different level of residual nitrate every year. And generally, we're still having to buy that nitrogen at some point. So if we had a corn crop the previous year that we had potentially over fertilized levels, and now we have high nitrate, that's still an expense to the system. Obviously, with a legume crop or something like that, we could look at it as more of a gain that we didn't necessarily have to pay for. But yeah, what you're saying is correct. That would change that profit curve. But at the end of the day, we just have to assign a value to that nitrogen somehow.
Thank you.
Yep.
We are at the top of the hour, so I recognize some folks are going to have to start dropping off. So I do just want to say thank you to everyone that attended today. I do believe both the speakers might have a few more minutes to entertain some additional questions, but just wanted to say thanks to those that might have to hop over to another meeting or go elsewhere now. So with that, I will actually turn it to Brian.
Yeah, Mike and Brady, what fertilizer products are you using in your trials for nitrogen?
Urea, basically.
And I use urea as well with some different additives. So we do both normal urea and super U also.
Right on. Do you think there would be any difference if a guy used anhydrous? Would there be a difference in your recommendations because of that?
Yes and no. Again, kind of going back to that it depends situation. So the reason we use Super U is we're trying to just make sure that efficiency is maximized. If you're following practices to try to maximize the efficiency of anhydrous, hopefully that outcome would be the same.
Yeah, in ours it's side banded urea, so that we're expecting little losses from that use. But we are in wheat, experimenting with banded applications of things like Super U, and particularly in canola. I know I'm off topic here, but with canola, you have a bigger risk of shallow banding, and you can have a bigger risk of some nitrogen losses occurring from that. So we're looking at whether some of these efficiency fertilizers can have a benefit even in a banded situation.
Interesting. And when are you guys applying the fertilizer?
Well, for our trials, it's side banded, so it's at the time of seeding.
And for us, it depends on the research we're doing. So the stuff I presented today, that was all at the time of planting.
Thank you.
Additional questions? All right. I think that wraps things up. And for those of you still on, the recording will be available for this likely later today, if not sent out by tomorrow. And also, if anybody needs to get in touch with the speakers too, you can reach out to me directly. I can get you in contact with them. But thanks everyone for their attention today. Thanks to AMBA, the MBRI, and CMBTC for sponsoring this event. And with that, I will say goodbye, and hopefully you all can join us in January at our next webinar that's going to be focusing on threats to no-till progress and whether or not we're able to continue the kind of transition over to no-till and challenges that we may face in barley production systems in doing that. So hope to see you all in January. Take care, everyone.